This is Contracts, Basics of Common Law Contract Formation. I'm Professor Scott DeVito. Let's begin. Our objectives for today is to make sure that our listeners have a basic understanding of contract formation. Let's take a 20,000-foot look, get some basic concepts under our belt, and then we can take a deeper dive. First, what's a contract? Well, in the most generic sense, it's a particular kind of binding obligation between at least two parties. Now, I say particular kind because what you're probably going to learn in your contracts class, if you're taking one, and if you listen to these podcasts, you'll hear the same material, that there are multiple kinds of binding obligation that we deal with in contracts law. So we might talk about completed gifts, we might talk about contracts, we might talk about this thing called promissory estoppel, we may talk about equitable estoppel, and we may talk about restitution, quasi-contract, or unjust enrichment. A contract is, each of those are a particular kind of binding obligation, and a contract is just one of those that we talk about. And we know we have a contract when we have things like offer, acceptance, and consideration. Now, other people will talk about a contract as being bargain and exchange, or they may use the phrase manifestation of mutual assent to a bargain in exchange and consideration. What I want you to understand is that each three of these is a perfectly acceptable way to talk about contract formation. If you have any one of those three and you can demonstrate that your facts meet the elements for any one of those three, you're going to be able to prove that a contract was formed. We are going to focus in on offer, acceptance, and consideration because I find that for my students, that is the thing they encounter the most. I personally think the best approach is the manifestation of mutual assent to a bargain in exchange and consideration because it really clarifies this bargain and exchange and how it all fits together. But for pedagogical purposes in the context of the wider world, it turns out that students are better off being introduced to offer, acceptance, and consideration in the right way, and then later on demonstrating that all three of these things can be proven by the same subset of rules. In other words, later on in another video, I'm going to show you that if you can prove you've got offer, acceptance, and consideration, you'll be able to prove that you've got bargain in exchange and manifestation of mutual assent to a bargain in exchange and consideration. So at the end of the day, they all actually work out to be the same thing. We're just going to focus in or zero in on this one definition, offer plus acceptance plus consideration. One thing that we may run into and that may be confusing for students or people listening to this video is the difference between formation and enforcement. When we talk about formation, we're asking whether the contract came into existence. Did you and I create a contract, a binding obligation between the two of us? That's a formation question. We then can also ask, well, even if the contract was formed, did come into existence, will a court force the parties to do what they promised to do in that contract? That's enforcement. So as you're going through, keep your ear, and not for the next couple of weeks, but as you're learning about contracts, keep your ear open, recognize that there is a concept of formation, and a lot of what you're talking about at first is whether a contract was formed, and then once you understand whether a contract was formed, you begin to worry as to whether that formed contract can be enforced. Let's get down into the details. Now, we're up the 20,000-foot level. We're going to come all the way down, and we're going to look at the details. So what's an offer? I'm going to refer to the Restatement Second of Contracts for a lot of my definitions, primarily because I think that that's a good place, and they've got good, clear definitions. And I really commend you to take a look at the Restatement Second of Contracts. It's got great comments and illustrations that explain all of these concepts. So it defines an offer as a manifestation of willingness to enter into a bargain so made as to justify another person in understanding that his assent to that bargain is invited and will conclude it. When you read that, it seems like a very big, complicated paragraph. Always remember that your job in interpreting and understanding the law is to break that up into its core elements or components. So here I broke it up. You can shrink this and clean it up more, but I broke it up just so you'd see how the pieces work together. In order to have an offer, you've got to have this thing called a manifestation of willingness to enter into a bargain. And I've got some slides that clarify that in this presentation. Actually, it's in the offer presentation. Then you have to have a manifestation be of such a caliber that it justifies another person in understanding that his assent to that bargain is invited, and that manifestation's got to be the kind of manifestation that justifies another person in understanding that his assent to that bargain will conclude it. So you got to manifest a willingness to enter into a bargain, and the person listening has to know or be justified in knowing that their assent is invited and will conclude or create the contract. And we'll talk about these secondary elements, these manifestations, where you've got to understand in the offeree a little later in a video, probably 2 or 3 down, not offer, not acceptance, but later when we talk about manifestation of mutual assent. So here's an example. Here's Bobby. He says, "Hey Otto, I would like to buy your 1968 Corvette Stingray for $25,000. That's an offer. He's manifested an intent to enter into an agreement, right? $25,000 for the Corvette in a way where Otto would know his assent is invited, and if he assents, will seal the deal. What about acceptance? That's the other end. You've got offer, and then you've got acceptance. Acceptance of an offer is a manifestation of assent to the terms thereof made by the offeree in a manner invited or required by the offer. So let's take a look at the elements for this. The first one is that there has to be a manifestation of assent to the terms of the offer. So you have to say yes, or yeah, I'd love to do that, something like that. Not only that, your manifestation of assent has to be in a manner invited by the offer, or if they've specified how they want you to accept, it has to be in the manner required by the offer. So here's Bobby, he made his offer. So Otto says, sure, there's your acceptance. He's manifested assent to the terms of the offer. Our next element is consideration. We've got offer, we've got acceptance, and now we need consideration. Consideration is going to be some right, interest, or profit, or benefit accruing to one party, or some forbearance, detriment, loss, or responsibility given, suffered, or undertaken by the other. The real way to think about this is, I can give you a benefit, or I can undertake an obligation for you. And then I've given you consideration. We have to be careful, though. My merely giving you consideration isn't going to be enough to form a contract. In order for there to be a consideration sufficient to form a contract, each party to the exchange must give their consideration in order to induce the other person's consideration. I've got a couple of examples to sort of clarify this point. I can give you $50 as a benefit. That's consideration. You can also give me consideration by mowing my lawn. You've undertaken a detriment by mowing my lawn, some sort of obligation. But it's only when my consideration is exchanged for your consideration that I have consideration sufficient to create a contract. So when we look at consideration, we recognize that we need this sort of generalized concept of consideration, which is where I give you a benefit or I undertake an obligation for you. And then we've got to have those considerations inducing each other. Each party has to induce the other's consideration. So here, Bobby wants to buy, Otto wants to accept, everything is great. What's the consideration? Well, Bobby is offering to give Otto money in order to induce Otto to give Bobby the vehicle. So giving the money is giving Otto a benefit. Otto giving the car is giving Bobby a benefit. Now you can flip that around. The benefit detriment language is somewhat confusing in my mind students often don't understand that a benefit can also be described as a detriment. So when Bobby gives a benefit of giving $25,000 to Otto, that's also undertaking an obligation by Bobby. So Bobby incurs a detriment. His detriment is the loss of that $25,000 or the obligation to provide that $25,000. Once you've got all of that, you've got a contract formed. This has been Contracts, Basics of Common Law Contract Formation. I am Professor Scott DeVito. Thank you.